Hello, everyone. Hello and welcome to the lecture and the talk to Lynne Segal, who is an Australian-born, British-based, psychology-trained, public intellectual, socialist, feminist, author, and activist. Lynne is Anniversary Professor of Psychology and Gender Studies in the Department of Psychological Studies at Birkbeck College. Her books include Is the Future Female?, Troubled Thoughts on Contemporary Feminism, Slow Motion, Changing Masculinities, Changing Men, and Straight Sex, Rethinking the Politics of Pleasure. She co-wrote Beyond the Fragments, Feminism and the Making of Socialism with Shayla Rowbotham and Hilary Wainwright, as well as the Care Manifesto with 5 other co-writers. Her latest book is Lean on Me. She continues to lend her voice to discussing issues of global politics, feminism, aging, care, and joy. Welcome to Croatia and welcome to Zagreb, Lynne.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here in Zagreb at this 17th Subversive Festival. Many of my friends have been here before, so I'm very glad that I made it now. Anyway, I've actually been writing on care for years, maybe for decades, but explicitly on care for many years now, except that now I find that it's getting harder and harder to talk cheerfully about care in such a terribly uncaring time, such dark times that are almost the very nemesis of care. Indeed, as a Jewish activist who's long worked for peace in the Middle East, I'm finding it harder and harder to talk in any composed way about politics right now, and especially about care for ourselves, care for each other, care for the world, as all the time things are happening which are just so much the very opposite of what we want in these, especially traumatic times. As Brett memorably wrote, and as I put up there, back in 1939, forced to flee his homeland with the Nazis coming to power, even to talk about trees is almost a crime, because it entails silence about so many misdeeds. The fear I have is that we're heading towards such times again. Too much silence, such appalling misdeeds. Western governments, particularly my own and the USA, but also the EU, still refusing to act seriously to prevent Israel's apocalyptic violence in Gaza, following the unexpected atrocity of Hamas on October the 7th, with the brutal massacre in southern Israel and over 200 hostages taken to Gaza. Netanyahu's immediate declaration of war on Gaza has resulted in altogether unprecedented bombing for almost 9 months now, leaving no safe space for civilians anywhere at all in Gaza, not even in Rafah. So far, as you probably know, well over 35,000 Palestinians have been killed, many of them buried or burnt alive. Hundreds of thousands have been injured, and 2 million people are now displaced and destitute, more than half of them children. Their buildings flattened, their infrastructures having disappeared. Those left alive, all homeless, shattered, and many starving to death. The lack of Western governments to prevent the extremity of such violence is certainly unparalleled in my lifetime, and I've lived a long time. In the face of such unspeakable suffering, it's even more devastating to see one social media trend in Israel with people joyfully dressing up to mock Gazan deaths, agony and loss. So not concern and care is to the forefront here, obviously, but incitement to derision, which spreads total inhumanity among the many of the perpetrators of this spectacular violence. Surely it means Israel too can only emerge as lasting losers from such violence, given its genocidal nature. It's why, having worked, as I said, for over 2 decades for a just peace between Israel and Palestine, the situation transcends tragedy, creating inexpressible grief. I can only repeat again, these are the darkest times I've known in my life. The only relief I find nowadays is marching on the streets, demanding a ceasefire. Moments of hope, practices of care arise when solidarity is at its highest. And it's then that distances collapse between young and old, all together, mostly strangers to each other, with women in headscarves, children with Palestinian flags, Jews with our badges of identity. So, as I say, distances collapse across age, ethnicity, religious differences, and there's a sense that nothing bad can happen here in the streets, not violence, but only solidarity and care, with the transcendent emotions whenever I go, as I've been now 15 times, to marches calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. So, unsurprisingly, on these marches, the only trouble comes from the right trying to resist us, although we're always being told that we are violent on the marches, but there's been no violence other than those opposing us. Meanwhile, although the violence in Gaza is by far the worst catastrophe right now, it's not the only darkness on the horizon. Across Europe and beyond, we're witnessing the most troubling rise of the far right. And you'll have to tell me about Croatia, because I don't know the details of politics here. As you'll know, Italy is headed up by the far-right government of Giorgia Meloni. Marine Le Pen's populist nationalist party is said to be on track to win the French presidency, though I hope not. And we've seen the right come to power even in once solidly social democratic Sweden, while the far-right alternative in Germany, the AfD, is increasingly strong. Indeed, only the victory of the neoliberal Tusk in Poland slightly bucks that trend. Further afield, we've seen the shocking election so recently of the far-righter Xavier Milei in Argentina, which was recently, and still in many ways is, a bastion of progressive feminist and left struggles after finally jettisoning their military dictatorship only 40 years ago. Modi in India, Orban in Hungary, Trump still perhaps on the horizon. As well in Greece, we know that although the fascist Golden Dawn Party was banned for its violence against immigrants, its leaders have just been released from prison, and its ideals and followers have far from disappeared. Indeed, the far right apparently received over 14% of the vote in recent Greek elections and are working well with the centre-right government there, New Democracy, making that government Greece's most far-right parliament since the fall of the military dictatorship there in 1974. The Greek network studying the rise of the right there report that the views of Golden Dawn are still being mainstreamed in the press and other political parties, promoting extreme nationalism and violence towards refugees and migrants as a false answer to economic woes. Indeed, we see this evident everywhere in so many places around the world, the result promoting not just a lack of care for asylum seekers, but at times lethal violence towards refugees and migrants. And it's certainly all the more chilling that we see this happening around the 90th anniversary of Hitler becoming Chancellor of Germany, a lesson we're meant to have learned from. So, what is there left once the place of hope, standing for a more redistributive, caring and just world? Sadly, in most parts of the world, with some brief exceptions, it has been shrinking in the face of the neoliberal juggernaut rolling over us since the close of the 1970s. And this finally brings me to my scheduled topic for tonight, the need for a radical politics of care, something for which the women's liberation movement, my own lasting political formation and home, paved the way back in the 1970s. It all began by stressing the importance of domestic life and the devaluation and the marginalization of women, precisely because of the work assigned to women, because of the work which is seen as quintessentially unproductive. Women's work, the work of care, thought to be a mere labor of love. As you'll probably all know, a key goal of the women's liberation movement everywhere, which emerged at the close of the 1960s, was precisely to introduce new ways of seeing into the left. Indeed, ways of envisaging the total transformation of society, not just in terms of wages and state power, which the left had always talked about, but in how we live and how we care for each other. That's why women's liberation came in, wanting total social transformation at home, at work, everywhere. However, in the end, despite our critics, it was not feminism, but underlying economic shifts in contemporary capitalism that would result in the full-blown crisis of care we're now seeing today. I hope the slides are matching what I'm saying. I can't see since they're behind me. But they are they? That's good. Let me see if I can get them here and what I should be having up. Yes, our care collective. So, there are so many reasons for this crisis of care, which just a few years ago, a few of us in London sketched out in the Care Manifesto, which is here in your language, which is wonderful. And we were 5 scholars, each from different disciplines, working on care. Actually, we came together because I was already working on my other book, Lean on Me, about care. And my friend said, oh, we're interested in care. We want to form a reading group with you. So we did that. And then they said, oh, we want to write something too. So my book got shoved aside and we produced the manifesto. And we started on it before COVID, but when COVID came along, it was suddenly so popular, it got raced out into print by Verso, sold loads of copies, and has now been translated into about 13 or 14 languages. Yesterday I heard it was being translated into Farsi. So they could do with it in Iran, don't you think? Anyway, so what we were talking about in the Care Manifesto is that underlying this ongoing crisis of care is the continuing entrenchment of neoliberal policies and outlook from the close of the 1970s, as the right came to power in the UK under Margaret Thatcher, in the US under Ronald Reagan, soon influencing global politics in the EU and elsewhere. And what this has meant was the insistence on putting markets to the fore across the board, producing an economic order that enabled both the evisceration and the outsourcing of welfare states, whether schools, hospitals, whatever, this outsourcing all becoming normalized, and also the idea that we should judge ourselves according to our market worth. So that's the impact, both personally and politically and across our social sphere. So first up, as everything I mentioned from Lean on Me is also in the Care Manifesto, but I'm elaborating it further in Lean on Me. I argue we must enrich our impoverished language of care, as so many feminists, including, for instance, Joan Tronto and others in the USA, have been arguing for almost 4 decades now. And the point that we want to stress is that care is a very broad concept. We want to expand the notion of care to say it's not only the hands-on care of directly looking after the physical and emotional needs of others, crucial and difficult as that is, but it's also about recognizing our human interdependence, and it's about recognizing our shared vulnerability throughout our lives, not just in old age and not just as infants, but throughout our lives. We all depend upon the social structures that enable us to survive and live well in society. For surely, if the COVID pandemic taught us anything at all, it underlined this global interdependence. Care, then, we say, involves whatever it is that enables us all to live and to flourish along with the world that we inhabit. Now, I've said that care work has been undervalued because it's seen largely as women's work, which traditionally went unpaid, that labor of love, barely seen as work at all, routinely marginalized, seen as unproductive. Yet, feminists always stressed that care is the cornerstone of social reproduction, that is, of all that enables people to survive and to reproduce themselves. And so, in that sense, care work is both essential to and embedded within the economy. But this is hardly noticed in outlooks that can see no further than immediate markets and profit. Although, I must say, profit is being made a lot now from care work itself, from that outsourcing of care, which I'll come back to. So, caring is gendered, yet in today's world, with both women and men working long hours in paid jobs, we have a huge care deficit, particularly in the most industrialized countries in the richer world. And this is met by a whole global care chain of predominantly poor, predominantly immigrant and non-white women who perform. It's the next one, is it? Right. Good. It'd be good if you could keep a check on that. I find it hard to keep them both together. Who perform our caring work. Thus, racism combines with traditional sexism, along with global inequality, to further devalue caring in our time. Also, care work is undervalued, indeed often repudiated, because of the widespread contempt and devaluation of so-called dependency. Symbolic manhood, you'll probably know, has always presented itself as the very antithesis of dependency. This absurd gender cliché of men as independent and women as dependent has only been strengthened by the last 4 decades of neoliberal exaltation of individual resilience, autonomy, and productivity, all deepening the disavowal of actual human fragility and dependence. Ideal citizens today, male and female, must be tough and entrepreneurial, imagining themselves as entirely self-sufficient. They're encouraged to embrace self-care which they pay for, to keep themselves sleek and employable. Such pathologizing of dependency accompanied a constant shaming heaped upon welfare claimants, declared scroungers. I bet you've got some word for scroungers here, despite 12 times more tax evasion being from the rich rather than from any welfare fraud. Also, attending to the needs of others, to care metrics, not market metrics, often means confronting vulnerability. So however rewarding, however much we want to care for others, hands-on caring can be daunting and it can be exhausting, confronting us with our own and others' mortal embodied selves. So that's also why it's been traditionally relegated to women, or else to servants, people deemed inferior precisely because they're doing this vital, visceral, tactile work of maintenance. So avoiding caring can thereby enable others to disavow thoughts of their own inescapable fragility and their own inevitable mortality. Not having to care about others has been a sign of wealth and power, as the late anthropologist David Graeber noted, in Caring Too Much. That's the curse of the working classes. Though he would also go on to argue that the ability to care, both caring and being cared for, because they're connected, caring for and being cared for, is actually what is most basic to and most important about human life overall. And I could go on at length about that, but I won't have time. So it's precisely these complexities and challenges of care, because of the very mixed emotions caring may involve, that we need to fight for all the necessary social infrastructures and resources to enable us to carry out the work of caring, from our queer or alternative kinship networks to rebuilding and revaluing our caring professions, rebuilding our communities, and caring for, not plundering, the world at large. Have I got dependency and autonomy up there now? So, far from public spending creating pathologies of dependency, as the political right like to say, the very reverse is true. Only with adequate and secure resources can everyone develop and maintain whatever capabilities they have to ensure some sense of autonomy and to escape from being rendered helpless and passive, whatever their age or condition. Disability rights activists, as we'll see, have always known this, arguing for a notion of independence and control over their lives, despite recognition of their dependence on distinct forms of care. Thus, we have to jettison any linking of dependency with pathology. Dependence and autonomy are not binaries, pointing in opposite directions, as people like to tell us, but two sides of the very same coin. It is those with most resources who actually routinely depend on others who service them most, while those in greatest need of care frequently receive least help. In developing all these thoughts in Lean on Me, this latest book of mine, I stepped back to take measure of all that has changed in my own lifetime. I think I need to go to the next slide. Have we got mothers up there? All right, sorry. Both for better and more recently for worse. My particular story is UK-based, but it certainly has resonances elsewhere, and you can tell me about that here. In much of the Western world, the emergence of women's liberation, thriving in the 1970s, created a movement eagerly seeking transformation, as I've said, transformation on all fronts, beginning with the ties drawn between the home and the workplace, the reproductive and productive systems. Thus, Lean on Me opens by reflecting on motherhood and what's changed in relation to motherhood, which provides most people's blueprint for caring. In one of its very earliest key struggles, which I was involved in, women's liberation was busy trying to overturn the isolation and marginalization of women's post-war experiences of motherhood, something which we knew well from our own mothers' troubled lives. What's more, there were initially, in the 1970s, many victories, especially in securing reproductive rights, abortion rights, in confronting doctors' arrogance, or the feeling of helplessness women had so often felt in maternity wards, as well as in fighting for and in winning more funding for nurseries. This occurred alongside of success in increasing women's financial independence in the workplace, while demanding men's greater involvement in domestic work. So it was precisely these struggles that were my life, that was my life and the life of my friends, both women and men, back in the 1970s. What is now so shocking is how quickly such victories could begin to be snatched away, with even reproductive rights curtailed in many parts of the USA, and today further threatened by a possible Trump victory, while in Britain, post-Thatcher and the later arrival of austerity regimes, welfare and community resources have just kept on shrinking. It's hard to ignore the distress of mothers today, routinely pressed for time, money and resources. In Britain, as in the USA, we read that hardly any mothers feel they are doing an adequate job of parenting. It's a completely new idea for me. None of us were worried in that way that we weren't doing a proper job of parenting. And as another Israeli-born British academic, Shani Orgad, for example, finds from her recent research, even affluent stay-at-home mums mention constant anxieties raising children in this ultra-competitive world today, while displaying the old sense of isolation and exclusion that mothers back in the 1950s and 1960s once expressed to feminists. Scholars such as Jacqueline Rose and Eliane Glaser in Britain also recently distilled the effects of this chilling heartlessness towards mothers with the cutback of resources. So the statistics are that half of all British mothers suffer mental health problems before and after giving birth. 50%, half of all mothers, report chronic loneliness, and suicide is the leading cause of death for mothers during the baby's first year. So, given all that feminists fought for and seem to be winning, that we're back again with these old struggles is quite amazing for older feminists like me. Similar patterns emerge in education. Have I got that up there? My workplace for 50 years in the UK, as in the US and elsewhere, we've seen rising inequality within schools, along with attacks on the very notion of education for its own sake. Universities are increasingly forced to conform to market dogma, whereas once they offered an alternative ethic, even an antidote, as some saw it, to the commercial world, by insisting upon the value of pursuing learning entirely for its own sake, in the process producing more knowledgeable people and societies. Whereas today, our universities are judged on the outcome of the money paid to the jobs that their students get, not whether they feel more aware of the world and more involved in the world. So the assault on the humanities is yet another attempt to marketize education and sort of marketize people and deny them the tools to understand the world better and to assist us in exploring and finding useful ways to create a fairer, more caring world. So in Lean on Me, as I mentioned, I also prioritize the significance of disability struggles in opening out the complexities of vulnerability. I've got disability up there, and showing why autonomy and dependence, as I've said, are two sides of the very same coin. Here again, disability activists at first won many struggles promoting what they called a social model of disability, not an illness model, but a social model of disability. They rejected the notion of themselves as intrinsically vulnerable, which had routinely being used as a pretext for their exclusion from public life. Disability activists, many of them in the most moving language and colourful and vivid performances, as I show there, expressed their sense of extreme exclusion, the suspicions and dismissive attitudes greeting them much of the time when applying for any benefits or extra resources, while also celebrating all that they could be, and indeed sometimes are. At first, in the 1970s and early 80s, again, activists won battles for greater access to the social infrastructures others could rely upon in using public transport, entering public buildings, leading to increased social inclusion and self-reliance. The only problem was that this language of self-reliance could, and later would, be distorted to tune in with the damaging contempt for dependency, always shadowing attempts to cut back on welfare provision at the very heart of neoliberal thinking. Some, like me, carefully pondering issues of vulnerability, prefer to stress interdependence rather than autonomy, interdependence, rather than emphasizing only independence, which aligns itself a little too readily with that denigration of dependency and accords with mainstream thinking in failing to stress the importance of social relationships. Far worse, under new austerity regimes, such as we've seen in the UK since 2010, there were soon constant assaults on those in need of any sort of disability support, with endless demands that the disabled had to prove themselves, prove that they were unfit to work, so that there were constant capability tests imposed, which many failed, were made to fail, whatever their physical or emotional impairment. In the UK, repeatedly testing individuals' fitness for work produced the continual denial of much-needed support to many, leading to increasing and untold misery, even suicide, for many disabled people wrongly assessed, with much class and race bias, as you can imagine. Very similar stories arise when we look at aging, given the millions of older people whose needs are not being met today, and were, of course, lethally neglected in the early COVID years, at least in Britain and the US. Fears of aging haunt us all, not just of mortality, but fears of frailty and dependence, of knowing that we have to rely on others. It's this that can generate such alarm, even defensive paranoia, resulting in neglect and avoidance of old people unless they are fit and robust. So much stigma faces old people, old crones especially, women, that it can undermine our sense of who we are or our place in the world. Many older people routinely confront loneliness and neglect in old age, devoid of responsive care, empathy, and friendships. Indeed, Age UK reports that 500,000 older people rarely see anyone at all, perhaps only once a week, while poverty, race, and ethnicity, again, play a big role in producing deprivation amongst the elderly. For some time now, I've been trying to use my own experiences, I'm in my 80s, my own experience of being old, to battle ageism. Yet at present, the overall care for the elderly still remains abysmal. And this is all tied in with the privatization of the public sector, that outsourcing of welfare that I talked about, which in the UK has meant the financialization of care homes and the outsourcing of public care provision, creating big profits for the global few, while leaving many simply unable to pay for the essential care they need. There's lots of moving things have been written about this, at least in Britain and I'm sure elsewhere. Meanwhile, underpaid care workers, mostly those immigrant, black, ethnic minority workers, lack the time and resources to care adequately. So here again, we see care ethics completely at odds with market ethics. It all incentivizes poor care, low wages, and neglect, with little regard for the people it's supposed to be looking after. And that was a statement from a Tory MP, from a Conservative MP in Britain. In the end, it's hard to focus on any one area of neglect when wherever we look, we see others. In my book, I also address the harms of the prison system, which you will have heard about from Angela Davis, which is all about inequality and the missing place of care in our societies overall, as stressed by the anti-prison movement. Given the role of entrenched racism, the anti-prison movement sprung up first and foremost in the USA, with voices like those you've heard of Angela Davis, merely the most familiar. And ever since, black people have been in the forefront of connecting our appalling prison system and its ties to the lack of care overall. The cruelties of our time are also writ large in the neglect and abuse of asylum seekers, with the UK, like Europe overall, completely failing to tackle this problem. Indeed, official hostility towards asylum seekers is evident globally. The bodies of refugees, you probably know now, carpet the Mediterranean, turning it into the world's largest burial ground, following the reluctance of British and European states to rescue migrant boats in trouble. The British government's current shameful attempts to deport refugees to Rwanda has rightly been described as treating refugees just like human waste, and a refusal to understand what has driven people in the first place to seek shelter elsewhere and risk their lives doing so. Yet, despite all the complicity with racism guiding government policies, there is also much care and much solidarity evident from many battling to assist asylum seekers. In her collection, The New Internationalists, written a few years ago by my friend Sue Clayton, she collects the reflections of some 60 of these activist volunteers from the many, many thousands she knows are working, trying to counter the inhumanity towards asylum seekers. Clayton herself worked to assist many children she found stranded in the Calais jungle, which was documented in her film, Calais Children, a Case to Answer. These children had a right to come to Britain. They had relatives in Britain, but the British government wouldn't process them to enable them to do so. Other volunteers provide emergency aid for refugees, conducting sea rescues, sometimes prosecuted for doing so, or help to organize advocacy in support of migrants. These activists also register the catastrophic failures of international NGOs, professional NGOs, unable to do more than stand by as refugees are herded into oppressive holding grounds, sometimes waiting interminably as asylum applications are being processed, unable to work, and hence obviously can be seen as a drain on the economy when all they want to do is work and contribute to the society they've come to. My own birthplace, Australia, was ahead of the game with its disgraceful asylum strategy, imprisoning refugees offshore for a while in the notorious Manus Island detention centre in Papua New Guinea. One inmate for many years there, the Kurdish journalist Behrouz Boochani, fleeing persecution in Iran. After eventually gaining asylum in New Zealand and having extraordinarily, while imprisoned on Manus Island, managed to publish a book describing his ordeal, No Friend But the Mountain, Boochani now dedicates his life to helping empower marginalized people everywhere, aiming, as he puts it, to rehumanize the dehumanized. Working with Australian Aboriginal peoples, for instance, Buchani emphasises the ties between refugees and Indigenous people, such as Australian Aborigines, noting that we humans have no sanctuary except in mutual warmth and support. And this all brings me finally to government's refusal. Did I do the asylum seekers and then the protectors? Yeah. Government's refusal to confront climate change. Here, indeed, it's crucial to value the resistance from Indigenous voices, as well as the price they've paid, systematically murdered with impunity. In the UK, for instance, we're now living with polluted rivers, deliberately polluted in order to make profit by our water companies, while aware of climate disasters around the globe. Yet, as British climate activist George Monbiot has been illustrating for decades, our government primarily responds only to their own largest backers, and those largest backers are damaging fossil fuel producers. Today, of course, we've seen the maddening idiocy of the latest COP28, the UN-sponsored global meeting on climate change in Dubai, headed up by the leading fossil fuel producers globally, the startlingly notorious Sultan Al-Jaber. Meanwhile, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, as if speaking to the wind, calls out governments' lack of concern about fossil fuels, war on nature, as senseless and suicidal. So, how to end when I could easily go on forever and keep you here all night? Well, only by re-emphasizing, like so many today, most prominently perhaps Judith Butler in all her recent writing, that we must begin from the recognition of human interdependence on each other and on the planet we all inhabit, as well as recognizing our shared vulnerability throughout our lives. And this has to entail, derailing our current capitalist regimes with its current neoliberal obsessions with markets, beginning with rebuilding all our weakened social infrastructures across the board and detaching them from finance capital. It means also rebuilding our local communities, which have been clobbered by central government, knowing that adequate care for all is the only basis for a truly democratic society. And it means that instead of pursuing endless growth, which all our politicians talk about, we start tackling instead inequality by focusing how to deliver social and ecological well-being for all. And we also need to celebrate our mutual aid practices while arguing that we're all collectively responsible for supporting each other. No care passes. No one doesn't have to care in their lives, as well as helping to maintain our communities, something we should all be doing, as we're doing here, while preserving public spaces generally and working for a green, sustainable economy. That becomes possible only once we fight for and win shorter working hours in our jobs and a basic income for all, which some unions are currently highlighting. So let me conclude by suggesting that some sense of public engagement is necessary, both for sustaining our confidence individually. The more involved we are, usually, the more cheerful we are, and the less involved we are, the more depressed and isolated we often feel, as well as for preserving our sense of shared humanity. Such a shared humanity requires a cosmopolitan outlook. Let's fight for mutual care, not just self-care, helping us to combat isolation and sometimes at least experiencing more joy together in the process. Again, in the end, all we have is each other. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynne. I'll start the conversation, and I hope you will all join. So please raise your hands while we're talking if you want to ask a question, give a comment, or... I wanted to ask you, I put some questions down, and now I'm not going to ask you the first question that I meant, and that was, have we already lost? So we won't go back there. You said it at the beginning that it's the darkest, probably the darkest time of your life. But I would ask you the question about the power. We operate in this world with the power. So it's a military power, it's economic power, it's all type of powers, political power, who has more power, who has less power. Can we think of vulnerability as a power?
Only insofar as we recognize that we're all vulnerable and insist that we're all vulnerable and talk about all the things that we know that we rely on education, on transport, on our doctors, on our nurses, almost all of them underpaid. During COVID, we were out there clapping for our carers, clapping for nurses in particular. Then they demanded a pay rise, and the doctors demanded a pay rise. Oh no, we don't want to hear about that. So I think the point about recognizing vulnerability is one of solidarity, one of seeing, they're not different from us. If they're disabled, if they're old, if they're ill, particular illnesses they might have, the illnesses we might get, the illnesses, we have friends who have those illnesses. So it's the recognition of vulnerability that hopefully creates solidarity, which then creates power to the people. That was like on all our first marches, power to the people, power to the people. And, that's often been sung and so on, power to the people. That's about recognizing vulnerability, recognizing that, everything, capitalism works by keeping us alive in order to go to the workplace. You're always hoping, our government's usually hoping to provide the minimum necessary to get those they see as most fit and able into the workplace to make the profits. But power to the people is saying, no, life isn't about making profits for the few. Life is about us all caring for each other and trying to create this better world in which everybody can thrive as best they can, So it's that recognition of vulnerability that should be able to create a sense of solidarity, of this global interconnection. And that's why COVID should have been interesting on that. COVID should have been interesting. No country actually didn't end up with COVID, even though Trump liked to call it the Chinese disease, the China disease or something, He was probably maximally responsible for spreading COVID, I would have thought. But instead of getting the right lesson from that about interconnection and the need for care, somehow it's about individuals somehow increasing their own strength and authority rather than that collectivity.
I wanted to ask you, the concept of radical care actually sounds very scary. And it sounds very expensive, not only in material, like in terms of money, but in terms of nerves and life. And it's very disconcerting because it means the complete change of our foundations as we know them now. And that means thinking about ourselves, thinking about the society. I remember a few years back at a party, a friend of mine told me, oh, we should all grow our food. And I was like, ooh, I'm going to be, starving if I grow my food. But it is that type of a radical concept. So my question would be, what are the responses to your proposition?
Well, I think if we think in terms of mutual aid, going back then to that moment of need for radical care during COVID, mutual aid groups grew up everywhere, didn't they? Everywhere. And now, when people are back in the workplace, it's true that some of them collapsed, but they haven't all collapsed. You know, people like Rebecca Solnit always has a lot to say about this. She talks about moments of great harm, such as the storms that came to New Orleans and so on, and how then you got people's health centers and other ways of distribution of food set up. And many of those have survived to this day. I mean, unfortunately, what we have, most typical of everybody involved in trying to help distribute care, are our food banks in Britain. Now, you know, every little place has a food bank because wages have been allowed to get so low and so on. And ever so many people I know either go to help out at the food bank or collect what's been left in shops, food and so on, to take to the food bank. And then also it has to be in a community centre, so other events happen in that community centre. Or another thing that I engage with is a cafe called the Second Chance Cafe, which on Thursdays and Fridays provides, you know, interesting meals, which you pay what you can afford. So some people pay nothing if they're on welfare or happen to be unemployed. Other people like me obviously pay a good amount, and many people I know, when they can, volunteer either to cook or to help. And there's such a sense of cheer. Actually, people say, I have friends who are all different from each other, and we go there, and one friend says to me, I can't bear the way everyone's so cheerful and friendly. And I said, oh, I love it. And other people say, I love to come here because everyone's so friendly and cheerful. So, I mean, I think what studies show, and again during COVID, a study at LSE showed that those people engaged in helping work were the most cheerful, and those who didn't engage in that, you know, were the least cheerful. So I think it's not, you know, feeling in some way important in the world is what makes us feel good about ourselves. And the problem is, in most jobs, much of the time, as again that anthropologist David Graeber wrote about in Bullshit Jobs, people don't feel that they're contributing usefully to others. And therefore, if they were working a lot less time in those jobs and able to engage more in feeling, well, at least, you know I'm helping people, then they could feel better. So I don't think radical care is necessarily scary. The point about it is that everybody should think in terms of care, not as they have these care passes out, that they don't have to care. And think also that for good care, there has to be resources in the community. And for good communities, we have to have a healthy world. So that it's not that it's scary, but it is about bringing, really, the personal is political, bringing all of politics together to think, to make the links between the different areas of life.
Yeah, and that's what you argue in the Care Manifesto. Actually, you go from the global
That's
level
right.
to the very personal level, and that is kind of the whole world. How do we go about it? But I wanted to ask you, who are the agents of care? I mean, we have learned to think about it as those are individuals. So it's your grandmother, it's your uncle, it's your neighbor, it's some individual people, your colleagues or your sometimes boss. But who are the actual agents of care that we should demand?
It happens at all levels. I'd say we're all agents of care, including those in most need of care. I mean, I know many people who've done, elementary care work, caring for people, with Parkinson's or with MS or, very old people. And, sometimes they're getting so much back from this work, even though they're underpaid. They're devastated when that person dies and they no longer have to do that care work, even those doing it unpaid. I mean, it is a two-way process. A lot of the loneliness of older people is having no one to care for, no one who depends on them. So we're all agents of care, but also you need resources and good resources to care. Now you can say that's a tall order, but a significant percentage of state resources now is going on warfare. You know, there are incredibly negative uses of our resources, aren't there, that, you know, we need a rebalance. We need a complete rebalance to think healthy people in a healthy community, in a healthy world. It's certainly a tall order, as, you know, one way in which the right has been able to mobilize is to say it's these outsiders, these others, anyone who looks different from us. And that goes right back to my childhood in the 50s and 60s. Anyone who looks different from us is the source of the problem, and to be frightened, you know, that someone we need to fear. To say that is just upside down. You know, we need to think, how do we think of ourselves in a global world? How do we think that way? And once we start thinking that way, then our lives seem more important, our ideas are more important. And so care is something we should all be doing, however much in need of care we are. But, you know, we care for our carers. I mean, I've read books now in the States where care is so privatized and you get these underpaid care workers. It is actually the so-called vulnerable elderly person that has all the control, because they can just dismiss one care worker and get another care worker. So they actually are in control of the care, not the person giving the care. And so it's, once you see that interaction, but an interaction at all levels, at the personal, in the family, and that's why, you know, we talk in the manifesto about promiscuous care. That was something we argued about, by the way. Promiscuous care, doesn't that mean you can just drop it? No, it doesn't mean you can just drop it. It means that, you know, care isn't just what happens inside a nuclear heterosexual family. It's what is happening all the time, you know, in our schools, in our workplaces and so on. That's the idea of promiscuous care. Anybody can care for others. It's interesting as well, in the beginning, I was actually writing about care when my friends came wanting to also write about it. And some of them said, we don't like the word care, because the word care seemed already to bring vulnerability or something they didn't like. Of course, it's always feminine term and so on. Isn't solidarity better? But care is a lot more than solidarity, because, you know, you can, you know, I have solidarity with Palestinians and the people of Gaza, but there's not much I can do other than keep calling for ceasefire and so on. But I've forgotten what I'm talking about now. But oh yes, why it's not just solidarity, it's also, you know, what we're doing. So it's actually on those marches, I said, on those marches that we see, you know, Arabs and Islamic people and Jews who are all meant to hate each other, not only not hating each other, you know, but looking out for each other, being so happy to see each other there, trying to create something different. So I don't think it is necessarily scary if you think of it in that way, as how we're all together trying to create something better.
Not to be the doomsayer, but the experience of COVID-19 pandemic was like, at one moment, it really looked like the world will change. Yes. The nature started, yes, you know, claiming back, and people were kind of open. And then, at the same time, people were craving the normal, the back to normal. That was and back to normal is basically you climb up the social ladder by rejecting or not caring for others, and that is the kind of a goal of a person to come up so high on the social ladder that you actually can be by yourself in this illusion that everybody is caring for you. So in that sense, the CARE Manifesto actually came as a really mobilizing book. You just said now that it's been translated into 13 languages. Mm-hmm. And I would ask, can you explain us just a bit from the CARE Manifesto about the tools, how to build the capacity to care, and what to do about it so that we are not depressed and that we see our own ability to care for others, no matter how low on the social ladder we are.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, how much mental illness and how much loneliness we have in our society. You know, they say 1 in 4 people suffer from loneliness, and indeed that's a number I think they give for mental illness. And there are class and race dynamics to that. You know, people in very deprived situations are often especially depressed or more vulnerable perhaps to mental illness. But it's totally also across the board. And it seems to me that if you're thinking of combating that, then we need to be thinking about our place with our friends, in our communities. We need, you know, particularly for me as an old person, to be thinking intergenerational. If I write another book, it's probably going to be called Radical Friendship, about intergenerational friendships. Because, you know, in our society now, friendships tend to be very homogeneous, same class, same education level, same age. You know, what I'm interested in the fact that progressive political work is often crucially dependent on friendship. And I've read about histories of the spread of communism and the spread of other, of feminism as well. We're dependent upon those friendships, nationally and internationally, or at least acquaintances, friends of friends, to help organize and, you know, for you to get to me, to come here and so on, and put me up in a nice way and see Croatia. You know, these friendship networks are hugely important, but hugely important for our own well-being, being seen as connected to others. You know, and so once you see your own well-being as being connected to others, and it really is connected to others, and being less fearful of others is a healthier way to be, isn't it? You know, because the opposite just creates increasing paranoia and nastiness and meanness, and I don't think that makes for a happier life. On our deathbeds, it's not going to think, I made loads of money. We need to think, I really feel that I help make change in certain ways. You know, I hope my life is important in some way, you know, even if it is, you know, volunteering at that local cafe or at the food bank and so on, just building from below but across, you know, building locally but looking across. And I think that gives you a deeper sense of agency. Because if it's just about yourself, well, what's the point of just being about yourself? If nobody needs you, if nobody, you know, that doesn't make for, it seems to me, for a good life.
That we kind of need structures because people, like in Croatia, there are different scenes, let's put them like that. Different structures organized. You now explained in the UK different structures. But how do we grow them bigger? How do we include people who don't feel invited, people who feel intimidated, or people who think that it's a clique of friends?
Well, you always do have that problem. I mean, I feel I'm so lucky being in my 80s because every decade seemed made for me. So I come of age into the 1960s, which is the age of sexual liberation and hedonism, which I tried to make the best of. Then I become a mother in 69, and that's the decade of feminism, the heyday of feminism. So we're all thinking about how do we help mothers and make things better for mothers and so on, which seems to have gone backwards now. Then as I get older still, and the left is in decline with the right in control in so many places, then I start writing, and I can make use of the fact that I actually, oh yes, I am an academic. I am meant to be teaching and writing and reading. So then I got into writing my books. Everything seemed to fit in. now in my old age to emphasize care and the fact that we need to care, it's good to care. That's also something that fits with me being a very old person. So my point is, I feel very lucky that somehow I've been around at the right time, in the right place for many of the ideas that were there. But, you know, in our food banks, many friends of mine help out at food banks. And then friends or people they meet in the food bank, they really do befriend them, and they then come and say, oh, but can you help me with my garden? Can you help me? And sometimes they can and sometimes they can't. But, you know, the fear is that if we don't get social support to help us in our good deeds, then they'll all collapse. And so we certainly have to be fighting for that social support. But I feel, in a sense, doing any good deeds also, you know, it does expand the possibility of others. Like I talked about that book, The New Internationalists, those engaged in working with refugees. And, you know, and they form welcoming communities. I don't know if you have anything like that here, welcoming communities. And that, you know, that's such a nice sense of being a welcoming community, isn't it? And, you know, so it's important for our own souls, but to feel that we're able to, as I said before, connect with others. So you know, all these things are tall orders, and if public money shrinks and shrinks, it does get harder. But also, it's like, what use is going to be made of that public money? You know, we're hopefully about to get a Labour government here, but a Labour government this time, as last time, that says, oh, don't worry, we're not going to tax super rich people who've not got 3 times as wealthy over the last 10 years any more than they were ever taxed before, which is totally absurd to me. Of course, they should be taxed 3 times as much but as they were before, but they're saying they're not. But, you know, behind the scenes, in our last Labour government, you actually always do get a lowering of inequality. You do get more money put into health and put into education. So fighting for the most progressive governments you can get is always crucial. But at the same time, so are movement politics, so are, you know, keeping alive women's movements, anti-racist movements, and then welfare movements, or just differing things that are good, like holding these events, which hopefully give people food for thought, which hopefully then helps to connect people and make our lives feel just that little bit better. I hope.
Do we have questions?
I don't know whether we have time for this, actually, but I completely agree with you that we all need care and we should all care more. But what puzzles me a little bit is this ambiguity between paid and unpaid work. Because when it comes to organization, I think there are different, let's say, traps. And I assume that there's a lot of need for care. You mentioned young families, for example, and then there's also the problem of people being lonely. So it would be possible to allocate, you know, the lonely people to help voluntarily, the people who actually need it. It mustn't be only old people, young people. Can also be maybe migrants, who are asylum seekers who are not allowed to work, who are maybe bored or something, don't have contact. I mean, they could go there and do some care work and help them integrate, maybe. But the question is how to organize that. I mean, option 1 would be, okay, hope for voluntary happenings, that it's just happening somehow, I mean, spontaneously. That sounds a little bit optimistic, I think, because it could happen anytime and it's not enough, right? So there needs to be something. Then option B would be make it mandatory, but unpaid. That's very hard. That's authoritarian, but I mean, think about the affirmative action back in the 60s. It was mandatory, but it helped. It helped a little bit. I mean, we still have racism, you know, but the state can do something. And in Germany, where I come from, we have this idea that people after the school should have 1 year paid by the state. Well, paid by the state. Okay, maybe that's the thing. To work for 1 year in some kind of, either as a soldier, unfortunately, or as a social worker. And that would be something like a mandatory thing. Or you can say, option C, we have a new labor market of paid labor. But that, again, I mean, it brings such a lot of bureaucracy in a way. I mean, I can see that there's, for every 100 nurses or doctors that do it, we have 20 administration officials and a lot of, state power. And again, I see that, yeah, it would be nice to have more care work, but how do we actually do that? And I think, I just want to hear your ideas about how to best, along leftist lines, how to best organize that in a way without falling into one of these traps, like forced voluntary work or more administration, bureaucracy, or preaching, just like ethical, like you should do it. That also doesn't really help. So what should we do in practice?
You want to take more questions, or do you want me to ask?
Sorry, it's a very long question.
In these community caring places I've mentioned, such as the food banks and the Second Chance Cafe, they're very, very much frequented by asylum seekers who are helping prepare food, who are helping with the redistribution of food and so on, because of course they're not allowed to work. And that's one way of them integrating into Britain. At the same time, though, they're usually, pretty distressed that they're not allowed to work properly. But nevertheless, that is a crucial thing that they are doing. And I've made friends of all ages, including very young ages, refugee school children who help out at the Second Chance Cafe, who I think are much older, and then they turn out to be 13 or 14 or something, and they're really interested in talking to you, and it's wonderful to be with them. But I think in terms of care, you mentioned the ethics of care, and a lot of feminists writing about care were often philosophers talking about the ethics of care. And the ethics of care, I think we need to think about more broadly. For instance, what happens in education? In education now, which is so much around the individual child succeeding, that is not at all the only thing that should be a goal of education. The goal of education should be valuing how we relate to each other in the world and care for each other. So I think it's in the schools, it's in the universities, it's in our jobs. And, you do find some people, rich and poor, so one of the richest families in Britain is the Sainsbury's, and some of them are just Tories doing work I see as evil. Others of them are doing the opposite. James Sainsbury is busy, buying up buildings that can be used by people to show films and to meet together and so on. So, I mean, it's just somehow some people realize that doing good for others is doing good for yourself, that getting across that message, that caring for others is also caring for yourself. It's not, it's like it's self-care. It's not self-care, it's like worldly care. It's, I guess, you see it with indigenous people. What are they doing? I mean, they're just trying to protect their own sites of life and and their resources for living. But they've played this crucial role now, haven't they, at the forefront of climate change. And once we recognize that, again, you see, you value other people. You value other people really different from you. So that cosmopolitan feeling seems to me is just so much more healthy feeling to have than am I succeeding? Will I come top? By the way, from a Jewish family, we were all just meant to come top in every exam we ever sat for. And, if we came fifth, well, better luck next time. That life was about coming top in every exam you ever sat for. That's so crazy, isn't it? Not everyone can come top. And so, just seeing how silly that is, how silly the idea of this hierarchical world is, because the hierarchical world just creates so many people feeling failures and feeling left out. So the opposite, that opposite is what we should be promoting from kindergarten onwards and in our queer kinship networks.
But maybe you can expand more on caring economies and in this, maybe to this question that would be...
Yes, well, caring economies. I mean, one person I haven't mentioned is Naomi Klein, who's Canadian, And she set up a group and produced the LEAP Manifesto. And I did mention in Britain, George Monbiot, all these people are saying, or Anne Pettifer in Australia, in Britain, I live in Britain now, a feminist economist, saying, you know, when we talk about growth, but we shouldn't just talk about growth. The last thing we want is, you know, growth in the fuel industry. And yet that's what we're often getting growth in, because I say they're giving most money to governments. What we need is growth in the caring professions, but then, you know, shorter working times so people can be doing more of the caring work. So a green economy isn't just a growth economy. And insofar as it's a growth economy, it's growth in ways that are not plundering the environment. So that's what Naomi Klein or George Monbiot or others would emphasize. And that's the importance of linking everything across the board. I mean, you know, when we used to say the personal is political, and I come from this socialist feminist background, it meant that you really had to care about everything. So you had to go to more meetings than anyone else and engage in more activities than anyone else. On the other hand, it was an incredibly exciting and enlivening time. The sense that you just understood the world a bit better, and that, you know, the world wasn't just you and your success or you and your failure. It was, you know, connections between us. And seeing that, I think, makes things easy. Green economies, you know, are investing in creating food supplies, may not be locally based, but locally distributed. You know, there are local governments in Britain that have really gone out of their way to create more caring communities by trying to prioritize giving money to local, often cooperative business groups. Of course, when we still have a Tory government, they want exactly the opposite. Everything must be put out to tender. And so, you know, those financial corporations can put in these perfect plans that apparently are money-saving, and they're money-saving by penny pinching and 0 hours to people, only employing people or getting rid of people according to the jobs they're doing. You know, that is the opposite of what would be a green economy. But what would be a green economy is people able to work in places where they can see the value of what they're doing. And so a growth economy is trying to increase that capacity for people to work in places where they see the value of what they're doing. Even, you know, so even if it is fairly bureaucratic and routinized, they still see the point. They might be garbage collectors, but, you know, the garbage has to be collected. They see the point in that. And, you know, and if they have time to interact with the people rather than being employed, as they often are now, not by local councils, but, again, by some global financial markets, then they'll get more embittered in their jobs. So it's just a sense of people engagement in their communities.
If we have time. Thank you very much for this beautiful lecture. I wanted to say that, in my opinion, and I was listening to many lectures of this festival, this is, for me, one of the most important. Other lectures were really brilliant, but this is like one of the rare that is focused on solutions and such an important dimension of it. And my question would be, because I have a feeling you haven't mentioned that much about it, about the solidarity states, the phenomenon of solidarity states. The peak was in 80s. Now we have some maybe liberal versions of it in Northern Europe. What do you think? Is it realistic to expect some revival of a solidarity state?
Do you mean nation states? Or?
No, I mean politically, like states. I'm asking that because Croatia used to be one of such some time ago. Now, as you asked, and I can say it's taking a turn towards far right. but I have a remembrance of a solidarity state, and I think that would be one of the solutions. I wanted to hear your opinion. Thank you.
Like a welfare state, Ah, I see, yes. I mean, welfare states come in most parts of the world in a big way after the Second World War, don't they? When people, particularly returning soldiers, seem to have most sway and demanding more welfare, more schools, more money for people to go to universities. When I went to universities, it was free. Now it sort of bankrupts people going to university. So we can't really have solidarity or welfare states unless they're in the public sector, although democratically controlled in the public sector. But what we have now is the opposite, don't we? Putting them out to tender, to global finance. And you can't have, it's very difficult to have anything other than the squeezing of the workforce and people knowing that they're not able to do a proper job because they're being timed all the time, how much time they're spent caring from this individual or that individual. I don't know if Ken Loach is known here, but Ken Loach in Sorry I Missed You, and indeed in all his films, describes the effect of this outsourcing where I think in Sorry I Missed You, there's a care worker in that sort of wanting to spend more time, doing the necessary work, caring for the elderly person who she's visiting, but knowing that she has to cut corners to race on to the next person. So we have to not outsource, but insource, get back in to local government, rebuilding local government, rebuilding our communities is, giving more money to local government, and that's precisely what has been most squeezed, actually, in Britain since the late 1970s. Thatcher knew just what to attack, attack the unions, taking on the miners to attack the unions, less and less money to local government, because that's where, again, they organise spaces for, public participation and so on, but you squeeze them so tight that they don't have the money to build more public housing or to look after their parks properly and make sure that, all streets and parks are safe day or night and so on. So it's insourcing, rebuilding the public sector. And I do hope you don't move further to the right here. That would be such a disaster.
In the meantime, and I just heard that it's 6:30, right?
Yes.
So I would, if there are no more questions, I would take this conversation outside to the bar, if it's okay. Lynne, I would like to thank you very much for this really inspiring and a great lecture and talk. And I really invite you all to read the Care Manifesto that is translated in Croatian by AGM and published, and Lean on Me, Lynne's latest book. I hope it will soon be. It will be soon in Croatian as well. Thank you all.
Thank you for. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you all for translating this book and producing it here. I'm going to steal this book, as Abby
Manifest skrbi možete kupiti vani.